Chapter 12. The tomb's innards reeked of must and disuse, a moist, choking mist clouding the air and dampening the intruders as they entered. Vaughn let out a squeaking, rodent-like cough upon first entering, and Bolthier cast a wary glance on Fran, but she answered him with an expression of tranquility, and thus he did not voice his uncertainty. The nature of the mist that surrounded them seemed difficult to understand, for at times it appeared as a simple white fog billowing at their feet, and yet it also wafted up in mid-air, translucent until the light hit its surface at just the right angle. Still at other times, it seemed slivery, a mirror of sorts, and reflected their images all around them, some reversed, some upside down, some opaque, and some blurrily distorted. Bits of magicite lit the many corridors within the tomb, lending a subtle glow to the shapes and motions of the mist, and every so often it seemed to adopt a lifelike range of flexion, trailing after them like fingers and embracing them like smoke. The journey proved quite short in distance, but several sets of doors blocked the way, all locked with encrypted keys that the princess had to rack her brain to decode. The language of Dalmasca had changed little over the years, but it had long since been watered down in written form, the easier to make global communication possible, and the etched letters quite often bore an obscuringly thick layer of dust. Quite often the inscription of one door would lead them to another, a hidden wall panel, or a removable stone in the floor, that would lead them through a winding tunnel full of similar doors and riddles that culminated in a small chamber containing the key to the door they had originally sought to unlock. The sheer boredom of constantly backtracking wore heavily on all of them. After a full day of solving puzzles and putting up with Bolthier's remarks, the princess at last declared that they would rest for the night, and the cortege gratefully obeyed. While the surroundings did little to relax any of them, exhaustion had laid their imaginations to near waste, and they soon fell fast asleep, but Vaughn found himself unable to remain so, for each creak and moan of the ancient tomb roused him with a start. Upon waking in the darkness and being unable to lull himself asleep yet again, he found that the torch they had employed had been moved a few yards away, now vaguely lighting Ashalia's huddled form in the distance. Though he at first tried to return to sleep, he could not let his mind rest until he knew what troubled the princess so, and thus rose and approached her, speaking quietly so as not to wake the others.
"Hey, princess! Can't sleep?"
She regarded him briefly, but then turned her eyes back to the darkness beyond the corridor.
"No. Me, either,"
he replied.
"This place is creepy."
He paused for a moment, looking her over with a rather curious expression of rejection, and then hesitantly began to back off.
Right. I'll just let you." "Vaughn."
"Hey." She turned to face him, her eyes shining with concern.
"Do you hear that?" "I don't think so,"
he said, lingering awkwardly in place.
"You're sure?"
she asked.
"What am I supposed to hear?" "I don't know."
She returned her gaze to the floor.
"It must just be an echo of something." "Bats?"
he suggested, sitting at her side, though minding his boundaries.
"Perhaps,"
she said distantly.
"You okay?" "Fine. Just nervous." "Because of bats?" "Because of Bosch." "Oh, yeah. You know. I think he's telling the truth. And really, I hate to say that."
She huffed slightly, resting her chin on her knees.
"I want to say that. There's just too much to consider. I know,
Vaughn conceded.
Still seems weird that he'd stick with Landis and his brother would go with Arcadia.
Ashalia turned her head slightly away from him and spoke in a softened tone.
Bosch lost more than his brother did.
Receiving a curious glance from Vaughn, she continued,
he had a wife once. He doesn't talk about her. Geez,
Vaughn said quietly,
I had no idea. I heard she was pregnant when they killed her. Second thoughts. What happened to him has nothing to do with what happened to my father. If he did it, I'm not granting him any excuses.
He nodded.
If. Even so, how am I supposed to trust the brother of a murderer?
She raised her head abruptly, then, turning to peer down the blackened hallway and leaving no space in the conversation for a response, but Vaughn could not divine what had caught her attention, try as he did to see it within the shadows at which she stared.
You really don't hear that?
She asked.
No.
He replied, shaking his head apologetically.
Sorry.
The next morning, after spending nearly an hour on a single puzzle, they gained access to the floor below them. An ancient elevator had laid dormant below a set of doors, invisible to them, as it blended into the stonework of the floor. The doors they soon exposed as decoys, for when Ashalia compressed the proper stones that should have unlocked them, nothing happened. For a moment, they took into consideration that their solution had been wrong, but this seemed unlikely. The many stones that decorated the doors bore inscribed letters, and they had pushed back the ones that spelled Dalmasca and Nubradia, as prompted by the engravings on either side of the doorway, which depicted Rithwal's daughters being crowned. However, after a moment's thought, the ground beneath them rumbled, slowly lowering to the basement level that none had suspected existed. Before leaving the platform, they scanned the visible portions of the corridor before them for an exit, finding a staircase off to the side that led to a wall, which, even as they looked upon it, slid apart, allowing for a safe return to the upper level. The hallway before them appeared quite long and unobstructed by further safety precautions, though it remained dank and dim, lit but minimally by a few strategically placed chunks of magicite. They started down it nonetheless, realizing as they walked that they were heading for a chamber that sat underground, outside of the protection of the false storm above them. Though the people of the old days lacked technology, it seemed they had no short supply of cleverness. Presently, and seemingly out of nowhere, Fran questioned Bolthir and Viren,
"How much longer do you think you will live?"
While the randomness of it did not conform to the usual human conversation forms, Bolthir had grown accustomed to such outbursts, and had in fact become fond of using them himself, and thought nothing of it.
"Oh, I don't know,"
he replied, also in Viren.
"I figure I've probably got another 50 years in me, maybe 60 or 70 if I'm careful, but how likely is that?" "But 50 at least?"
she asked. Now he looked at her with mild concern.
"What are you getting at? Promise me 50.
Suddenly, a pain seemed to grow in her mind, and she stopped and held her head weakly for a moment before straightening, only to find the whole party now looked on her with curious concern.
"Too much for you?"
asked Bolthir, abandoning the Viren cover upon noticing the wariness of his companion's glares.
"Not yet," she replied, "but it thickens. I should go no farther." "What's wrong?"
Ash inquired, more out of suspicion than worry.
"Mist gathers underground,"
Fran explained.
It runs deep in this place.
Balthier stepped in glibly.
We can't feel it, but Viera are particularly sensitive to it. Nothing to worry about, though, Fran knows her limit. Well,
the princess continued.
Is it dangerous? Not the trusting type, are you?
She gave him a sharp glare, and Fran spoke before he could worsen the situation.
It can be very dangerous as these amounts, but it is also an aid. A dense mist allows the working of powerful things. That doesn't sound good,
said Bosch.
Do not fret,
she replied.
At such concentrations, your magicite should be a sight to behold. Let us hope,
said Ash.
Will you not continue on with us, then? I'm afraid not. As you wish. We will look for you on our way out.
The rest of the group turned to press forth on their journey, when Fran suddenly called out.
Bow.
Balthier continued walking, turning only briefly to address her in Vieren.
50, I promise.
They continued down the corridor, turning a corner and prying open another door, which led, of course, to yet another corridor. Before long, Penelo became aware of a small gathering of mist near her skirt and weakly batted at it a few times to no avail. Just as the phenomenon began to irritate her, she recalled the piece of synthetic nethicite that Monty had given her and pulled it out of her pocket. Sure enough, the mist followed it as she swished it about, and from time to time it warmed faintly and glowed dimly, though not so hot or so bright as it had back in the Lhasa mines. Taking note of her deft giggles and subdued dancing, Balthier addressed her a bit more curtly than he had originally intended.
What the devil is that?
She quickly clutched the stone in both hands and gave him a glare.
None of your business. Well, correct me if I'm wrong,
he continued, matching her pace,
but it looks quite a lot like nethicite. How do you know about that?
She asked.
None of your business,
he answered.
Don't you think for a minute you're ever getting your hands on it? Are you kidding? You couldn't pay me to take that chunk of garbage. Nethicite is notoriously ill-favored among Fran's gods. I'll take your word for it. How does it eat up the mist like that?
Vaughn asked, giving the stone an apprehensive inspection.
I don't really know,
Penelo replied, holding it out to give him a better look.
Feel it, it makes it all warm.
He touched it with a small, hesitant, mouse-like motion, then took it from her and felt it more wholly, his amazement showing clearly on his face with an almost childish wonderment. While he continued to inspect the nethicite and Penelo attempted to explain to the others what Monty had explained of it to her, the princess paused eerily, gazing into the stone's depths. Faintly, much like the chirp of a far-off bird, it whispered her name.
Ash.
Her eyes darted up to Azella's. He rarely used her nickname, usually only when his concern rose past normalcy.
Sorry,
she replied, numbly willing her feet to move. They all stared after her as she walked dazedly down the corridor, none thinking to follow until Azella's pursued her. She had missed out on the better half of their conversation, too distracted by the stone's call to pay any attention, staring at it for nearly 5 minutes without a word. Azella's had attempted to rouse her with 3 other titles before resorting to Ash. The doorway to the final chamber required 2 keys. 1, the princess gathered from the ancient inscriptions on the door, she already had, it had in fact been the first key she recovered. The other, though, posed something of a challenge, as her knowledge of the old alphabet did not stretch far enough to read it fluently, and much of the carving had been marred by dust and mold over the ages, obscuring what little she could read. She interpreted it as instructing her to seek out another chamber within the hallway behind them that held the key, and they searched the long walls of it tirelessly for nearly an hour before Bolthir happened upon a loose stone no more than 2 feet down from the great doors that they sought to open. Upon removal of the stone, they found the key sitting idly in the tiny alcove, and a sharp glare from Ashalia warned them about teasing her for her mistranslation, though Bolthir made no attempts to muffle his laughter. She inserted the keys into the massive stone lock simultaneously, and together they turned back the many granite gears that locked it in complex succession. The door split in two, and its halves parted a few feet, allowing the group passage, but before they ventured in, the princess stopped them, removing the keys from the lock. They then passed through, finding the room beyond completely devoid of treasures. Indeed, all that dwelled within the musty walls was a tall pyramid of stairs in the center. At its peak sat a stone coffin, behind which stood a pedestal which held aloft a plain, fist-sized stone. As they approached, the stone slab beneath their feet depressed a few inches under the burden of their weight, triggering the door to shut behind them abruptly. Ashalia turned toward the sound with a subtle smirk, holding up the keys.
"At least I read that part right,"
she said quietly. Bolthir rolled his eyes and stepped farther into the chamber, scanning its hollow expanse and turning to Ash expectantly.
"Forgive me for saying so, Princess, but it's awfully empty." "He was the Dynast king,"
she replied cattily.
"He had everything could ever want. So where is it?"
Bolthir quipped. She, too, approached the great staircase, looking to its height with wonder.
"His first daughter settled in the east," she explained, "his second daughter settled in the west, and here in his tomb he kept the proof that he was their father. That's all he wanted."
Bolthir crossed his arms and glowered at her.
"You're saying this is Rythwal's treasure?" "Yes. We had a deal, Highness. Our deal was that I would take the Midlight Shard and you would take everything else."
And now he paused, studying her with an oddly optimistic expression of admiration before granting her a mischievous smile.
Tricky. I like it."
She smirked proudly.
"Did you really expect me to pay for the services of a couple of high-flying lowlifes? Well, I suppose you learn something new every day,"
he mused.
"So tell me, Princess, how do you plan on getting home?"
At that moment, a great rumble shook the walls, sending clouds of dust puffing out of the tomb's crevices.
"What was that?"
Penelo asked quietly.
"The sandstorm, perhaps?"
Azella suggested.
"More like a ship,"
added Bolthir.
"They followed us?"
asked Bosch.
"Friends up there,"
Vaughn replied.
"She'd warn us." "There's too much mist here,"
said Bolthir.
"She'd be stranded." "What?"
asked Ash. He shot her a dirty look and seized the keys from her hand.
"Get your rock. I'm going back."
Ashalia wrinkled her nose in disgust as he walked away, then turned to the pedestal above and ascended the steps, though not as speedily as she would have liked, for the stone had grown slick with moss and condensation. When she at last reached the top, she carefully edged her way around the coffin that held her ancestral remains, taking note of the ornate carvings that covered it on all sides. She could decipher several words, most pertaining to Raithwal's achievements in life, proclaiming a servant of the ancient gods, trusted with their peace-giving powers. The large image that adorned the top panel of the box depicted the king in the height of his power, standing before his bowing people with a sword in one hand and a glowing gem in the other. His daughters flanked him, each holding a stone of their own. Turning her eyes from the coffin to the pillar on which the mid-light shard sat, Ash suddenly paused in wonder, for a faint flicker of light disrupted the air, and the mist before her quivered under the perceived weight of her reflection. But then the image diluted, fading briefly and reforming with deft weakness into the semblance of her dead husband. With a gasp, she lurched backward, falling against the edge of the coffin and disrupting the thick veil of dust that blanketed it. The motion quickly scattered the vision, though she knew she had seen Rassler there, clear as day. Below her, the others called her name, and she looked to them uncertainly, her mind momentarily dazed. And then her eyes caught sight of a faint carving behind the inscriptions on the stone covering of Raithwal's resting place, a more subtle addition to the deep cloven details of the imagery, previously obscured by the dust. Shadowy eyes hovered behind the royals, deft figures masked by the hatched lines carved into the background, and she briefly wondered if these were not the many gods of old, for in the youth of humanity, there had been pantheons of such beings believed to rule over fate and choice. But if Bolthir had been correct, she had no time to consider such things, and thus she turned back to the mid-light shard, reaching through the gathering mist and taking hold of it. In spite of the dank chill that penetrated the rest of the underground tomb, the stone emanated a gentle heat that warmed her hand and sent a shiver over her mind and body. Lifting the rock from its perch, she suddenly felt the resurgence of hope, the prospect of winning freedom for her people. The trek out of the tomb proved much shorter than the first trip. All of the doors now stood unlocked and wide open, and many of the hidden passageways were easily bypassed, as they had only served to house keys used on the main doors. The group made it out of the structure in under 20 minutes, but out in the desert sun, the entire 8th Fleet awaited them, having clearly caught on to the mist illusion that protected the tomb. Several dozen armed Arcadian soldiers greeted them at the entrance and escorted them aboard the Leviathan once more, where Geese awaited with arrogance evident even through his suit of judiciary armor.
"Nice to have you back, Famran,"
he said to Bolthir as the group was led onto the bridge.
"Bergen's been looking for you." "Sid, too, I hear,"
the pirate replied with a bitter smirk.
"Who's offering the better bounty?"
Before he could respond, Penelo entered behind the rest of the prisoners, and the judge cocked his head slightly downward to give her a foreboding steel glare.
"Well now,"
he growled.
"I knew you were trouble." "Oh, you're just a bitter old man,"
she sneered weakly.
"Just be thankful Prince Lamont isn't here to see you in custody,"
he replied.
"The Emperor would surely have you killed for breaking his son's heart." "Leave her alone,"
Ash snapped. Geese paused, looking her over tiredly.
"Ah, it is a tremendous honor to again be graced with your presence, Majesty,"
he told her with a frustrated but nevertheless egotistical sigh.
"You left us with such great dispatch upon our last encounter that I must confess I had begun to worry that we may have given your Highness some cause for offense." "Such a heartfelt display of remorse,"
she sneered.
"Now what is it that you want?" "I want you to give me the Nethysite." "The Nethysite?"
Penelo tightly gripped the stone Monty had given her, holding it behind her back and shaking her head frantically.
"No."
Turning a sour glare on her once more, Geese growled out his dissatisfaction.
"Do not flatter his little highness so, that is a base imitation."
And then, speaking to the group as a whole.
We seek Rythwal's legacy, the ancient relics of the dynast king, Deifacted Nethysite. Did you not tell them, Captain Vossler?
Majesty, Azelas said softly,
he speaks of the Midlight Shard, that is the Nethysite. You?
She jerked away from him, leveling on him a piercing glare of betrayal that caused him to step back as well.
You're working for them. No.
He defended.
Not for them, with them. It's for the greater good.
Bosch stepped to the princess's side.
Are you mad, Azelas? If we are to save Dalmasca, we must accept the truth,
Azelas replied bitterly.
I will fight this profitless battle no more. The captain has struck a wise bargain,
Geese added.
In return for the Midlight Shard, the Empire will permit Lady Ashalia to reclaim her throne, and the kingdom of Dalmasca will be restored.
Ash grit her teeth.
Dalmasca would be restored in the same way that Boujerba remains sovereign. Princess!
Azelas gently intervened.
Shut it, Azelas!
She snapped.
Haven't you said enough already? Honestly,
Geese replied, carefully withholding his smile beneath the steel that shielded him,
such a harsh tone is unbecoming of royalty. Just think on it. An entire kingdom for a stone, you must admit, it's more than a fair exchange.
Balthier glowered at him.
And when all is said and done, your master will have another pet. You're one to talk,
Geese scoffed.
Fetching rocks for the highest bidder. I understand you didn't even get fair payment for this one. You really are just a bitter old man, aren't you?
Balthier bit back.
You'd sooner kill Gramis than do any more tricks for him. Do you even know what Nethysite is capable of? What Sid is capable of?
Geese considered this a moment, holding eye contact with the pirate for a few intense seconds before turning back to Ash.
Lady Ashalia,
he said, suddenly calm once more,
let us take this poor wretch for the people of Dalmasca. Your Majesty wallows in indecision on peril of their heads.
He drew his sword and swiftly set it at Balthier's throat.
And his shall be the first to fall.
The pirate didn't so much as flinch.
Well, at least your sword is to the point.
Ash felt a strange flop in her stomach. The ever-present knot hadn't untied, and the butterflies hadn't awoken, but there was something there, something that jumped for the first time in 2 years. Her eyes met Balthier's fleetingly, and she held out the Midlight Shard, an eerie look of hypnotism on her face. Pleased to have his prize offered up so easily, Geese took the stone and lowered the sword.
Ash!
Balthier growled.
Shut up!
She lashed back. Geese stared lustfully at the Nethysite, a light in his eyes vaguely shining, visible even beyond the helmet, but then seeming to dim as though a mighty shadow had overcome it.
Captain Vossler,
he said, not bothering to look away from the treasure,
take them to the Shiva. They should have leave to return to Rabanastre soon.
Withholding a heavy sigh, Azelas and a small troop of Arcadian soldiers led the group back into the winding halls of the Leviathan, and Geese at last broke away from his fascination with the stone and handed it to an engineer.
I want you to assess its power. Forgive me, sir,
the man replied,
but did our orders not specify that we were to return the stone for testing? I will not chance returning with a stone that is yet unproven,
Geese snapped, prompting the engineer to jump into action. The equipment aboard the Leviathan proved limited, so the mechanics opted to use the ship's drive to make their assessment. They explained to Geese that once the stone was connected, the reaction should be easily measured, but he replied with all haughtiness that methods did not interest him, only results. Luckily for them, the results proved more than pleasing, for the rates of energy detected in the stone surpassed the rates found in all of the magicite utilized by the fleet as a whole, and the count still climbed. The surge of power that overcame Geese in that moment almost rivaled that of the stone, for, by having at last found true deifacted nethysite, he had attained the means of taking Arcadia back from the ailing emperor and assisting Vane in putting a victorious end to the long, bitter war that had plagued Ivalice for so long. At long last, Arcadia would take hold of the world and claim it as her own.
Something's wrong.
His thoughts halted abruptly as he turned to the group of soldiers and engineers gathered around the engine's main drive.
What?
He growled.
What is it?
The soldiers scrambled amid the machinery, trying desperately to remove the midlight shard and salvage what they could of the Leviathan's engine. The deifacted nethysite had begun to suck the energy out of the artificial nethysite that powered the ship, as well as the magicite that served as its backup generator. The fuel stagnated, and before long the lights began to flicker as the midlight shard sought other sources of energy.
Engine power is falling rapidly,
one of the soldiers reported.
It's negative. Impossible. We cannot maintain hover. Damn it, what's happened?
Geese demanded.
The nethysite is draining the ship's power.
Another soldier replied.
Disengage it at once. We're trying. It's no good.
One of the engineers spoke up amid the panic.
She'll reach critical in 300.
Geese racked his brain, but could come up with no solution. A soldier behind him reported cascade failure, and while the lights finally stabilized, a cloud of mist began to penetrate the walls, slowly filling the bridge. Having found no more energy to draw upon, the midlight shard had begun to release its own. The leisurely pace of the mist kept it from spreading immediately to the Leviathan's hangar, where Ashalia and her cortege had been taken to be loaded aboard an Atomos and ferried to the Shiva, but they had their own problems to handle. The princess found herself walking tight at Bosch's side, not just next to him, but against him. She didn't know why, either. What logic was there in clinging to one traitor while angry with another? She briefly considered slowing her steps to fall in line with Vaughn and Penello, true Dalmascans, but hesitated when struck by the realization that they were reliant on her, their princess, far more than she had to be reliant on them. Fran appeared to be quite irritated, holding her head dismally as she walked, and Balthier, she couldn't go near him, not after the flutter of emotion he had just stirred in her. She couldn't trust someone with that ability. It seemed, however, that Balthier held little trust in her as well, for, even surrounded by several soldiers, he berated her weakness without sympathy, and even ventured to insult Geese. The soldiers appeared to be losing their patience, and Azelas clearly only tolerated it for the sake of keeping peace with those who had been so generous in their offer to restore Dalmasca.
I can't believe you just handed it over to that bastard,
Balthier said to the princess.
You'd rather I'd let him kill you?
She growled back.
Better me than you. Since when are you so caring?
He shook his head.
Nethysite is powerful enough on its own, deifacted nethysite could take out a whole city and then some. Geese is going to overthrow the emperor.
Now Azelas stepped in.
Don't be ridiculous. He's sworn to protect the emperor. Oh, like you've sworn to protect Dalmasca.
Balthier asked. Ash shot the pirate a venomous glare.
Shut up, pirate!
Princess, Azelas replied, he has a point.
You shut up, too, traitor!
Balthier rolled his eyes.
There's that childish streak again.
And suddenly he noticed Fran staggering at his side, gripping her hair desperately and squeezing her eyes shut as though in pain.
Fran?
He asked.
Such heat?
She replied dizzily.
The mist is burning.
Balthier stopped, prompting the soldiers escorting the group to pause as well, ill at ease with such a display. Fran bent slightly at the waist, hunched over despairingly, and Balthier took her hands in his and lowered slightly in an attempt to meet her eyes.
SHHH? How bad is it?
She shook her head.
I don't know. Bad. Come on, Franny. My God,
said Ash, ferociousness giving way to genuine concern.
What's wrong?
Before either pirate could answer, a soldier approached, sword drawn in a show of authority.
All right, lovebirds, break it up. We have to get her out of here,
Balthier replied, more to the soldier than the princess.
Oh, quit trying to be a hero for your lady,
he went on.
You'll all go to the same dungeon. She's not my lady,
the pirate groaned, negotiating his irons to allow him to place his arms around Fran's shoulders.
She's a Vieira, and she can't handle this. Hey!
The small, curious gasp came from Penelo, who quickly drew their attention due to the glowing, manufactured nethicite she held in her shackled hands. Balthier paused momentarily, eyes wide and fixed on the sight.
Uh-oh!
The soldier pulled him to his feet while another approached Fran.
You! Stand!
Fran remained crouched on the floor trembling, eyes shut tightly and holding her head in agony, shaking it as though attempting to free herself of some burdening presence within it. As the guard leaned down to force her up, she knocked him back, at least 6 feet. The other soldiers released their prisoners in a panic, running to restrain the enraged Vieira, but she quickly broke through the chains binding her wrists and met them in furious combat. None expected the slight woman's strength to be what it was, but she threw punches with unheard-of force, taking out guards with all 4 limbs and leaping away from their counter-attacks with hair-like agility and speed.
It's absorbing more mist,
Balthier calmly explained to Penelo. As chaos quickly descended on the room, Penelo glanced about anxiously.
But I don't see any. Oh.
As if on cue, mist began to seep into sight, billowing at their feet and reflecting reversed visions of the events taking place around the room, thereby making it difficult to tell just how close Fran's onslaught came to their position.
Well,
Balthier groaned,
so much for Plan A.
Fran continued beating back the soldiers with inhuman strength, though she appeared to be unusually aggravated, in pain, even. Though at least a dozen guards came at her with swords drawn, the speed of her attacks rendered them useless. One came close to landing a killing blow, but Fran managed to bend his blade with a single kick.
What's wrong with her?
Bosch asked Balthier.
Mist overdose,
he explained, picking the locks of each prisoner's bindings.
Geese is releasing the midlight shard. What do you mean releasing it?
Ashalia pressed.
It's spent thousands of years absorbing mist, right?
Balthier replied.
He's releasing it. So, either he's committing suicide, or he has no bloody idea what's going on. I like Fran's idea,
said Vaughn.
Let's get out of here. Right,
Balthier agreed.
Penelo, give me the Nephthysite.
She recoiled, clutching the stone protectively in both hands.
No way. I'll give it back.
The pirate insisted.
You know I don't want the damn thing. What are you going to do with it? Help Fran. How? Keep it close to her. It'll absorb the mist before she does. Hopefully. Millimeter.
Her eyes darted between him and the stone, but the memory of their first escape from the Leviathan stuck in her head, and she finally gave in.
All right. But you better take good care of it.
He took it as the mist thickened between them.
Monty would kill me otherwise,
he said with a smirk.
Go help your worthless brother get us a ship. Hey!
Vaughn exclaimed.
Okay,
Penelo replied, taking his hand and disappearing into the shimmering fog. Balthier turned to address Bosch and the princess only to find them missing, but figured that if both were gone, they were likely together, and thus dropped the matter and began inching his way toward Fran. However, his assumption proved quite wrong, for Azelas had taken Ashalia by the arm while all backs were turned, and now struggled to force her to an Atomos.
Princess,
he begged, gripping her wrist as she attempted to fight him off,
please just listen. I have listened enough.
She snapped.
I had faith in you Azelas, you above all others. How could you do this?
She nearly freed herself, but he seized her opposite arm, stabilizing his hold on her.
This is what we've been fighting for,
he insisted.
You'll have your throne back at last. My throne,
she growled, thrashing against his grip.
I will not play puppet to Gramis. I will not shame myself like Ondor. Vossler.
They both paused at the interruption, turning to see Bosch behind them, sword drawn.
Let her go. You know this is for her own good,
Azelas stated sternly.
She's not a child anymore,
said Bosch.
She can make her own decisions.
Azelas drew his sword as well.
Do you want Dalmasca to end up like Landis? Stop it!
Ash cried.
I don't want it to end up like Bougerba,
Bosch countered.
Bougerba may be shamed,
said Azelas,
but the Marquis is still alive. Bosch!
Ash pleaded.
Don't hurt him. I'm not the one to worry about,
Azelas replied. Before Ashalia could intervene, Azelas raised his blade and Bosch met it, and her eyes widened at the sound of the clash like those of a cat interrupted while in the midst of a midnight hunt. Azelas had released her, and yet she felt more securely entrapped than ever as she watched her two dearest knights viciously swing steel at each other. She had seen her country torn apart, and now what little she had left threatened to succumb to the same fate. Bosch and Azelas appeared oblivious to her emotions and perhaps too worried about her physical presence, less concerned with parrying each other's blows than with forcing each other to lose ground near her. Fearing the potential ends of the fight if she did not end it for them, Ash edged closer, but could voice no words amid the violence of their struggle and the roar of the bedlam that surrounded them. Before long, another squadron of soldiers entered, but they paid no heed to the minor battle between bodyguards, too distracted with Fran's increasingly brutal attacks. Bolthir struggled to get close enough to Fran to block off the mist, but her violent outbursts made this nearly impossible. Vaughn and Penelo had found no luck in starting up any of the Atomo's crafts in the hangar, but dared not get near enough to Bolthir to ask for assistance. Ashalia watched helplessly as her knights brawled, unable to break them up and unsure of whether or not she wished either one victory. Her lips parted, searching for words, but found none, and her eyes seemed to expand as the moments passed, revealing more and more the extent of her horror. Fortunately, the fight did not last long, as Bosch managed to floor Azelas with equine swiftness. While he could not disarm him, he struck faster from above than Azelas could from below, landing the finishing blow with such speed that Ash briefly squeezed her eyes shut before remembering the depth of the friendship the two knights had shared. The blade fell at Azelas's throat, but halted mere inches away, hanging in place while Bosch turned to Ashalia hesitantly. She opened her eyes and met his briefly, and then approached.
"Come on,"
she said sternly.
"What?"
Azelas asked as Bosch backed off.
"Come on,"
she repeated, taking his hand.
"We're leaving."
He resisted her pull with wide, confused eyes.
"We."
She knelt on one knee beside him and gripped his arm, but still could not drag him to his feet.
"Azelas, I don't have time for this. Bosch is framed and you hate him, but I'm guilty and you forgive me in a matter of minutes."
A grudging yank got him to his knees, but she could move him no farther.
"I don't hate Bosch. Now come on." "Highness, look on what my haste has wrought."
In resisting her desperate tugs, he accidentally threw her off balance so that she fell to her knees before him.
"I can serve you no longer,"
he insisted.
"No. You're coming."
With little thought, she fell forward against him, pulling him into a tight embrace.
"You're coming with us." "Ash,"
he whispered, apprehensively squeezing her.
"I'm tired. I just can't do this anymore."
She leaned back, gazing at him with utter disbelief, but she barely managed to begin a protest when she felt his hand on hers. Looking down, she bit her lip babyishly as he laid the hilt of his sword in her hand, the sword he had been knighted with nearly 20 years ago.
"I taught you to fight for yourself,"
he told her.
"Now go do it."
Bosch gently touched her shoulder upon noticing the wet glisten of her eyes, but she did not look away from Azelas.
"Princess!"
Taking in a breath to suppress a rather obvious sob, she shook off his hand and stood, then ran for the Atomos without a word. Bosch released a sigh, then turned back to Azelas, who remained kneeling before him in shame. Unable to look Bosch in the eyes, he turned his face down and ran his hands through his hair despairingly.
"All I have done,"
he whispered, feeling his own eyes dampen.
"I've ever thought of Dalmasca first." "I know,"
said Bosch.
"I would never gainsay your loyalty. Keep her well."
He nodded.
"Goodbye."
In the Atomos, Vaughn and Penelo tended to the ailing Fran, while Ashalia sat beside Bolthir, mournfully looking over the sword laid across her lap, tracing the lettering on the blade with her fingers, just as she had done so many times as a child. Bolthir kept himself busy with trying to get the craft in the air, though he didn't seem to be having much luck.
"Bosch!"
he exclaimed as the captain entered.
"Get your ass in here!"
He promptly obeyed.
"What is it?" "Here. Take the reins."
Balthier stood and shoved Bosch into the pilot's seat.
The mist is shorting us out. I've got to hotwire it. But I've never. Look.
He began demonstrating the dead controls.
Right, left, up, down, fast, slow. Don't worry, it's easy. Soon as the power goes on, get us the hell out of here. Balthier.
It was no use. Balthier had already disappeared into the cabin, and quickly made his way to the cramped engine room beyond, finding the magicite within it sparking as mist choked the wires bound to it. It appeared that the mid-light shard had not absorbed the power of the stone, as it had begun to release its pent-up mist before its reach stretched to the hangar, but the combined power of the magicite and the mist now overloaded the circuitry, sending sparks flying about the engine, dangerously close to the backup fuel line. Finding nothing with which to protect his hands from electrical burns, Balthier resorted to giving the magicite a firm kick, disengaging it and sending it flying against the wall behind him. The engine spurred, and the Atomos lurched, and Bosch haphazardly steered them out of the hangar and away from the fleet. Unfortunately, the cloud of mist remained with the Leviathan, and the engine's empty power socket quickly ran out of energy as the small chamber cleared of mist. Balthier grabbed the magicite, cursing as he discovered the hard way that it had not yet thoroughly cooled, and shoved it back in place, alternating hands as the pain grew. The Atomos regained its hover, and he rubbed his palms together, blowing on them carefully, relieved to see that no serious damage had been done, but he soon realized that he'd left a considerably inexperienced pilot at the controls and returned to the cockpit with due haste.
I am this close to getting us all killed,
Bosch warned with the appropriate gesture.
Right. Sorry,
said Balthier, taking his place and quickly getting the small craft back under control.
This might get a little dicey.
Fran raised her head dismally, looking out the window with swooning eyes.
The mist. It manifests now. Is that what you call this?
Vaughn replied. As the ship zipped crisply out of the fleet's midst, the Leviathan passed from the view of the cockpit window, and Ash rushed to the back of the Atomos to see, with Bosch quietly following her. From the back window, the entire fleet appeared quite clear, and though only a small cloud of mist blocked the back of the flagship, she somehow knew it would be more than enough. All too quickly, a white light surged from the Leviathan, flashing yellow, then white once more, and finally an eerie purple-black, like oil on water or soot on snow, murky and unnatural. Very little sound seemed to accompany the burst, though the princess wondered if she had in fact just drowned it out with her pounding pulse. The Atomos had made it clear of the blast with a bit of room to spare, but as the light died down and the smoke cleared, the devastation that had been wrought on the Eighth Fleet became painfully evident. Not a scrap of the Leviathan remained, and what pieces of the lesser ships had survived fell from the sky, scorched and flaming. A wave of aftershock hit the Atomos, but it did no damage, and Ash hardly felt it, far too lost in thought. Her right hand gripped the hilt of the sword until her knuckles whitened, and her left absently reached for Bosch, first linking her arm around his, then finding and grasping his hand with more strength than he would have thought possible for a woman of so slight a stature.
Are we clear?
Balthier asked.
Seems so,
said Bosch.
Everybody in one piece. Everybody but Azelas,
Ash all but whispered in return. Unsure of what to say, he squeezed her hand a bit, which he hadn't dared to do when she first took hold of his, but this only brought her back to her senses, causing her to release her hold on him and turn away awkwardly.
Penelo.
Fran wearily held the nethicite out to the girl.
Thank you. Anytime,
she replied, taking it with uncomfortable relief. Fran headed for the back room, a distinct lag in her steps.
I'm going to lie down.
Debris scattered across the whitened sand below, occasionally reflecting the desert sun, but one particularly bright flash glimmered at them repeatedly, emitting an ethereal light that alternated colors as it struggled to shine.
What's that?
Penelo asked, pointing it out. They all studied the light, noting that the scraps of the fleet around it had been reduced to only tiny remnants, no chunks, no recognizable pieces, just bits of metal and plumes of smoke. The object that glowed at them proved too small to be clearly discerned, even in comparison to the debris that surrounded it, but they each came to the same conclusion, which Ash quietly voiced.
I think it's the midlight shard. Don't tell me you want to go back for it.
Balthier groaned.
I still need proof of my identity,
she bit back. He rolled his eyes, eager to return to his own ship, but not about to leave a chunk of nethicite lying around for Imperial search and rescue teams to find.
Fine.